Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. Now in today's video, I'm going to be giving a spoiler-free review for Ancillary Justice by Ann Leckie, the first book in the Imperial Radch trilogy. So, what is the premise for Ancillary Justice? Well, thousands of years in the future, the Radch Empire is expanding through space and annexing other planets. Now, the Empire uses spaceships that have AI in order to control human bodies that are soldiers known as ancillaries. And we follow one such ancillary known as Breck across two timelines. One follows Breck on a quest for revenge, and the other is set 20 years earlier that follows the events that set Breck along that path. So the first thing that I wanted to get into was the writing style, because Leckie doesn't spoon-feed the reader information. A little like the plot itself, the world and the characters are a bit of a mystery, and while I did feel a tad confused at times, some of the things that I was having issues with did become more clear by the end of the book. One example of how the writing can be a little disorienting is that culturally, the Radch Empire doesn't make a distinction between genders, and this is reflected in their language, as rather than using pronouns he, she, or they, all genders are referred to as she. And this can make it a little confusing to the reader when you are trying to discern the gender of certain characters. But what I liked about how this was incorporated into the book is that it wasn't accompanied by any over-explanation. Rather, Leckie left it up to the readers in order for us to try and make sense and compare it to our own understandings of culture and language. So digging a little further into the concepts and themes, I think this is where the book really excelled. One particularly cool sci-fi concept was the idea that a spaceship was linked to multiple entities with a single artificial intelligence. So, how does one define identity when that identity is comprised of multiple entities? An analogy I thought of in order to try and relate to this concept as a human was, imagine if there was a brain in your hand. So you now have two brains, and these brains, they can interact with each other. They are aware of each other's thoughts, but they can act independently. Now, what would that mean for your identity? What would that mean for your sense of self? Now ask the question, what would happen if that hand were to get cut off? Alright, we got a thing from the Addams Family situation. What does it mean for that brain that is now disconnected from the rest of the body? Is it now an independent identity, or is it an incomplete one? I wouldn't describe this as a hard sci-fi book, but I did enjoy the concepts and technology that Leckie introduced, and that's something that I actually wanted more of in the book, and it'll be something that I'd be hoping to see more of in the sequels, but we'll get to those in a minute. Moving on to characters, Breck is the main character, and I found it quite interesting to read a first-person story from the POV of an artificially intelligent character. Now, reading the book, Breck often to me felt quite human, but there was always something that was just that little bit off, and I could never quite put my finger on what it was. And I'm not sure whether that's down to my own incompetence or Ann Leckie's brilliance, but I think that's actually a successful representation of an artificially intelligent character in the sense that they are almost human, just not quite. Now personally, I'm not sure I found Breck's character arc to be super satisfying, but at the same time, does it make sense to compare an AI character to my expectations for emotional and character growth, which are arguably human characteristics? And when it came to the supporting characters, I did find them to be somewhat distinct, but I never became really emotionally invested in them. And so for that reason, I think there were certain moments that didn't quite land as hard as they potentially could have. When it comes to plot and pacing, I would say that Ancillary Justice is on the slower side, which has its pros and cons. One of the things that I think worked in its favor is that Leckie really took her time to explore the world, and learning about some of the cultural intricacies of the Radch was quite interesting, and the dialogue about social faux pas was quite entertaining. However, having said that, there were multiple page discussions about things like fishing or drinking tea, which personally I felt like dragged the pace down just a little bit. I've heard in the sequels there's even more drinking tea, which is pretty surprising to me because the amount of tea in book 1 is already pretty memeable. In terms of the structure, I think the two timelines were used rather effectively. It's a technique that I've read before and I don't think it was too hard to follow. I have heard the structure in this book compared to the one used in Use of Weapons, and I would say if you've read that book by Ian M. Banks in the Culture series, it's quite different. We have two timelines, but they're moving in opposite directions. So I would say that is definitely more complex and more confusing, and you shouldn't have too much trouble following Ancillary Justice. However, there was one time jump that I think was handled a little clumsily. I found it surprising that we spent so many pages talking about tea, but so little talking about that certain time period. In terms of the story arc as a whole, I think Leckie did a good job of creating mysteries, but was a little less successful in terms of building tension and escalating action. I was always intrigued, but the story never quite got me excited. It was just lacking a few wow, jaw-dropping moments. So overall, I found Ancillary Justice to be an engaging read, and by pushing through some of the more confusing elements, I was rewarded with some interesting ideas and characters. While I did find the plot to be intriguing, it didn't quite reach the emotional heights that I think would have taken this book from good to great. So, to give it a score, my enjoyment for Ancillary Justice, I'm going to say a 7.5 out of 10. So this leaves me in a bit of a reading quandary, because I liked the first book, and I'm interested in the sequels, but I have heard that it focuses on the elements that I was less interested in. There is more tea and less technology. So let me know if you guys have read the books, particularly the sequels, and I could be swayed either way because I am interested. I'm just not sure how highly to prioritize the rest of the series on my TBR. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.